person we're interviewing today is Thomas R. Trautmann, who wrote an interesting book called Errands in British India. Tom, as I read this book, I became very fascinated with the whole issue of language and how the British used Sanskrit as a way of establishing kind of an interrelatedness between them and the people in India.
Language is very much what this book is about. It begins in the 18th century when the British and other Europeans were establishing colonies all over the world and were exploring languages that they didn't know and creating really a new history of the world out of the languages and language families that they formed by this exploration. And in the case of India, the Sanskrit language in which the ancient scriptures of the Hindus are written, the surprising thing that British scholars found was that it was very similar to the Greek and Latin that they had learned in university. And in the hands of Sir William Jones, this became what we call the Indo-European conception. That is the conception that the languages of India, descendants of this ancient Sanskrit language, are cousins to the languages of Europe, as well as Persian and a few Middle Eastern languages like Kurdish. But by and large, the Indo-European language family is a surprising one because it has two large separate groups of languages separated from one another by the Arabic and Turkish languages of the Middle East. The Indians and the Persians in the East are distant cousins then of the speakers of Romance languages and Germanic languages and Celtic languages and so forth, Slavic languages of Europe. And this surprising discovery led to a rewriting of the deep history of the world because it showed that thousands of years ago the speakers of Sanskrit and the speakers of Greek and Latin and so forth must have come from a single group of people living somewhere in Central Asia or Southern Russia or someplace like that, and that in the course of time they split up and radiated out into different directions, bringing these languages to Iran and to India on the one hand and to Europe on the other. That was the surprising discovery of Sir William Jones, who in 1784, in newly created British India in Bengal, created the Asiatic Society of Bengal, and who invented, in effect, this Indo-European idea. He wasn't the only one. There were others. There was a French Jesuit named Père Curdu, who came across the same, came to the same conclusion essentially, but Father Curdu's work isn't as well known because it wasn't published in a timely fashion. The Jesuits had been suppressed, their order had been suppressed. So in 1784, when Sir William Jones first announced this Indo-European idea, it was a first and a great breakthrough, really, the beginnings of scientific philology. In the same era, Englishmen were discovering the Malayo-Polynesian family. They were discovering, for example, that people as far apart as Madagascar and Hawaii belong to the same language family. And so on. So it was a period in which, because of exploration, because of Western imperial expansion across Asia, through the comparison of languages, the deep history of the world was being rewritten in a surprising way. And we were discovering, for example, Jones was involved in this discovery, that the gypsies of Europe are really speakers of a language that came from India. That's a completely new piece of information that was discovered in the late 1700s through comparison of languages. Jones was involved in that one too.
One of the things you were talking about is how race was a factor in this. Would you like to explain that some?
Yes, I would, because this book is really about how a discussion of language turns into a discussion of race, how it's captured by an increasing racial turn in discussions in the 19th century in Europe. As the story opens in the 18th century, race is not a word that's used very much, but it is used, and it's used interchangeably with nation. One of the things I'm trying to establish in this book is that race and nation are words that have completely different meanings in the 18th century, and only acquire the meanings they have for us in the middle of the 19th century. That is, for the 18th century, the races of man, or the nations of man, were understood largely through a conception that comes from the Bible, actually, from the book of Genesis. The story of the tree of nations, the descent of Noah and his 3 sons, and how these 3 sons have sons, and they become the patriarchs whose progeny are the nations of the world. And the Indians are one of these nations. When the English go to India, they view India through the lens of this story from the Bible, and they decide that, Sir William Jones, for example, decides that the reason that Sanskrit is like Latin and Greek is because the ancient Romans, the ancient Italians, and the ancient Indians are all descendants from the same son of Noah, namely Ham. That is his conception. So there's the ethnology of the 18th century is a branching structure, a tree, in which the whole human race is a family united through their descent from Adam and Eve, but a family in differing degrees of relatedness, of distance from one another. And so what the English find when they come to India and discover the similarity of Sanskrit to their own languages, what they discover is that the Indians are long-lost cousins. In a sense, in the long, deep past, there's a relationship between the people of India and the people of Europe. Now, in the 19th century, there grows up the ideas of race and the ideas of language begin to part company and to acquire different kinds of charges. The idea of the nation acquires a political charge by the effects of the growing ideal of the nation state. As the idea of nation becomes politicized, becomes attached to the idea that states should be based upon nations, upon ethnic groups, and those states should be based on popular sovereignty, that is, the will of the people who make up the nation. So nation becomes more politicized. Race becomes biologized. Race becomes, in the middle of the 19th century, there's a growing body of race science thinking in England and Europe, which views the bodily signs of complexion and hair kind, type, and so forth as outward signs of an inward essence. And it's that inward essence that constitutes race in the idea of this growing race science. Now, as that affects my story, the race science people are alarmed to find that in the idea of the Orientalists, Indians, who are dark of skin but civilized, are in the same language family as the white inhabitants of Europe. And so race science finds its way blocked by the Orientalist doctrine that has come out of Sir William Jones and his compatriots. And they speak of the tyranny of Sanskrit. Sanskrit meaning the doctrine that Sanskrit is related to the languages of Europe. This becomes an obstacle to the formation of a racialized notion of whiteness. And so it is this opposition was something I hadn't expected at all. But there is a moment of warfare about the 1850s in England in which the new race science is opposing the older Orientalist doctrine that had been established by the early Orientalists of British India. The doctrine that all the languages of Europe and of India and of North India are related to one another, and that there is a deep historical connection between the civilizations. The race science people were instrumental in forming a highly biologized and racialized idea of world civilization, and were in forming the architecture of an idea of whiteness that became politically useful in very nasty ways. And of course, students in my classes in the history of ancient India at the University of Michigan are very well aware that the word Aryan, for example, is used by racial hate groups even in our own country or indeed in our own state. But they're not aware that Aryan is a Sanskrit word to begin with. It's not a modern word at all, by which the early speakers of Sanskrit named themselves, and that this word was applied to the Indo-European conception at an early date by a Sanskritist in England, in Oxford, named Max Müller. He was German, but he made his career and a livelihood in Oxford. And that for Max Müller, for Sir William Jones, for other British Indians, the Indo-European idea was a sign of the friendship and relatedness of the Indian and the English people. That was to me, a surprising finding when I went down this avenue.
And I think it's in the introduction that this book is almost a love story in a way, that there's exploring this idea of the kinship or interrelatedness.
Yeah, I use this word love story. Admittedly, it's a little risks misunderstanding. What I mean is that it's a story of family love, that is, the English go to India as colonists. Some of them study Sanskrit and come to the conclusion that the Indians are their long-lost cousins or brothers. And this notion of brotherhood between English and Indian people within the framework of empire, I mean, it's a very colonialist construction of this brotherhood, is nevertheless an important trope in colonial writings. And in short here, in this case, in the case of British India, the meaning of the Aryan idea, therefore, is an inclusive one. It's a family meaning. It means the Aryan is used as an idea that speaks of the brotherhood or the inclusion of Indians and English rulers in the same family. Whereas later, in the rise of Nazism and so forth on the continent, Aryan was used as an exclusionary principle, a principle useful for a certain kind of hate politics that we're all aware of, to exclude Jews from the construction of a white European self. and that's why I wanted to talk about British India, because the very well-known story of Nazism and the rise of racial hate and the use of in the Indo-European idea and the Aryan idea for that purpose is very well known. What's not very well known at all, it seemed to me, was the way in which in British India all of these ideas had quite different significances. And the Aryan idea in particular had the significance of a family connection between Indians and their British rulers.
How did the Indians view this affection or this wanting to have a connectedness by the British to them? Did you have a feeling of how they reacted to it?
Well, yes. It's part of my argument that these ideas, which are scientific ones and indeed well-founded ones, I mean, the idea of the Indo-European family that Jones stumbled across is a real permanent addition to scientific knowledge. They're quite apart from the racial misuses of these ideas. They remain as ideas as a part of historical linguistics, ideas that we have found very, very sound, and they're still regarded as current. But the political meanings of those ideas have varied, is part of my argument. It's part of my argument that in British India, to the British, they meant different things than they meant to the Germans in the 20th century, for example. And they had different meanings for the Indians as well. In short, some of the Indians embraced the idea of a relationship with their colonial rulers. Others rejected it. But for the most part, the Aryan idea came to mean, by a kind of slippage, it came to mean the superiority of Hinduism over other religions, or the great antiquity of Hinduism, or the great moral superiority, preeminence of Hinduism. It tended to have that meaning for Indians. In the 19th century, for example, we find many expressions of that. So the same ideas have political resonances that are quite different in different parts of the world.
I thought it's also fascinating when you talk about Orientalism that in the book you differentiate between two kinds of Orientalists, or people who are interested in Oriental things. Mm-hmm. Can you one seemed to be, well, maybe you can explain it better than I.
Okay. Well, of course, this book got its start in large part because of the book called Orientalism by Edward Said. That's an important prior text for me. My field is ancient India, but that book got me studying the British study of ancient India beginning in the 18th century. Said's book speaks about a relation between Orientalist knowledge and colonialism as being very close and mutually entailed. That's a very important idea, because hitherto we've been treating Orientalist knowledge, and indeed all kinds of knowledge, on a model of disinterested scientific inquiry. And Said's book comes out of the essentially Foucauldian idea of power knowledge, that is, that power and knowledge are mutually entailed, and that disinterested knowledge as such doesn't exist, that knowledge is always has a political context, that it's enabled by power, it enables power, and so forth. Now, this idea means, for me, going back to examine the colonial roots of the stock of knowledge that I have been dealing with as a specialist in ancient India.
The interesting parts or elements of this book are the illustrations, and I thought some of them were very nice. And you've got this detail from a Hindu on the cover. Can you explain some of what the elements of that on the cover here?
Mm-hmm. The cover is a panorama of Hindu mythology taken from these very Sanskrit books that Sir William Jones was learning to read in the 1780s. They show, for example, the gods and the demons churning the ocean of milk, out of which come many treasures that are of benefits to mankind. Many-armed Hindu deity and signs of the zodiac. To understand this, first of all, we have to decide where this is, and I've really been enjoying testing the knowledge of my friends in Indian art history and asking them where this sculpture came, and then revealing to them that this sculpture of Hindu mythology came from St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and it is on the base of a statue, colossal statue of Sir William Jones, the inventor of the Indo-European idea.
Well, I think we've explored our topic. Thank you again for taking the time to go with this interview, with this new program, Rip Rap. We hope you've enjoyed this program, and we'd like to have you stay tuned for more programs like this. Thank you.